7 April 1945 East China Sea south of Kyushu. Admiral Raymond Spruance's 5th Fleet holds station, while Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 turns into the wind. Flight decks clear Avenger's launch with Mark 13 torpedoes fitted with drag rings and boxtails. Hellcats and Corsairs run escort Helldivers, stack above headings set for the last surface sortie the Imperial Japanese Navy can risk. Ahead, Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito steers for open water. Battleship Yamato has Captain Kosaku Aruga on the bridge. Light cruiser Yahagi carries Rear Admiral Keizo Komura's destroyer flag. The screen tightens, smoke gear stands ready. The first American section approaches at speeds and release heights that the old tables said would fail. Each Avenger levels briefly and drops. Torpedoes enter clean, stabilize, and hold track. A detonation registers on Yamato's port side as a distinct shock impulse through plating and deck fittings. Indicators jump, piping vents, internal communication reports flooding boundaries established and holding. Damage control teams move per drill, isolate, counter-flood, restore power. Aruga issues short, precise orders. Ito receives status in clipped sentences. The list changes by small measured increments felt by footing confirmed by clinometers. Hellcats make suppression runs to disrupt gun crews. Corsairs widen the lane for the next torpedo pattern. A second impact aft produces another pulse longer in duration recorded across compartments. Pumps come online, valve wheels spin, cable trays, shed dust. The change in trim is calculable. Now, loose equipment slides, scuppers, collect, wash and handrails show the angle more than eyes do. Yahagi accelerates to clear the predicted arcs. Komura's flag snaps through spray. An Avenger releases across her port quarter from an altitude that last year would have produced a skip or breakup. The weapon holds tracks and strikes. Power flickers. Shaft response degrades. The stern settles relative to the bow. Destroyers begin hard S-turns. Each maneuver alters presentation and briefly widens approach lanes for the next section. American radios stay minimal. Contact port beam. Run in. Release. Clear. No commentary, only sequence. A third hit forward on Yamato registers as a rapid series of structural vibrations rather than a single note. Boundary reports stack. Counter-flood orders repeat. Flak residue thins in the wind. Water finds predictable paths. Crews meet it with predictable actions. The air quiets to wind over the superstructure and the measured beat of pumps working against time. By late March 1945, the fight for Okinawa has begun, and everything afloat lives under 2 clocks, the daily grind of kamikaze alerts and the shorter, sharper problem of a surface breakout. Admiral Raymond Spruance's 5th Fleet must keep open a corridor for transports, oilers and fire support ships, while Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's fast carriers strike anything that moves toward that corridor. The Imperial Japanese Navy believes it can still hit a seam. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito takes Yamato Yahagi and a hard screen of destroyers into the East China Sea on a sortie designed to force an American decision, either pull carriers and escorts back toward the amphibious lodgment thinning the tucked combat air patrol, or accept that a battleship with 18-inch guns might reach the shipping lanes. Japan's confidence rests less on fuel or numbers, both are thin, and more on the residual aura of heavy surface firepower and destroyer acceleration. A fast turn by a screened flagship can compress a torpedo run. A heavy ship that closes to bombardment range can disrupt an entire day's landing cycle. In their mental model, American aerial torpedoes still carry the peacetime tables approach low, slow, straight, and die under layered flak and weaving wakes. That memory is not imaginary. Early war failures taught it to both sides. The assumption that those limits still bind, the attacker hangs over Tengo as a form of protection. For the Americans, the nightmare is time and geometry, not mystique. If a battleship and 4 or 5 destroyers punch through the air screen, even once transports and fire support ships on the Okinawa line of departure become large, slow targets at ranges where even near misses matter. Meanwhile, kamikaze traffic forces Mitcher to keep combat air patrols thick over the task groups and the transport area. Any diversion of fighters and torpedo bombers to chase a surface contact has to be brief and decisive. The carriers can generate deck loads in sequence, but the deck cycle is finite. Miss on the first passes, and the window tightens. That is where the new employment envelope of the Mark 13 matters. By spring 1945, Avengers can release at speeds and altitudes that were previously considered a gamble, with torpedoes fitted to take the water clean and hold track without skipping or broaching. The tactical result is not a miracle weapon, it is a change in approach geometry. Instead of one fragile telegraphed corridor along the wake, there are multiple crossing lanes from quarter and beam, each delivered by sections that do not have to fly into a flak tunnel at stall speed. For the defenders, the familiar play hard, weave, throw smoke, let the torpedo fall apart no longer buys the same probability. Spruance's aim is straightforward: prevent any Japanese surface force from touching the Okinawa traffic, and do it far enough from the lodgement that the amphibious tempo is unaffected. Mitcher's method is procedural: find, fix, mass and feed continuous sections until the target's options shrink to damage control decisions. The strike is not about a dueling narrative between named captains. It is about removing a category of threat so that the fleet can turn entirely to defending against aircraft and supporting troops ashore. Ito's calculus is different. Even a single bombardment run or a torpedo exchange inside the transport ring would carry political and psychological weight far beyond the tonnage sunk. Captain Kosaku Aruga can trust Yamato's armor and compartmentation to absorb punishment long enough to complete a mission measured in hours. Rear Admiral Keizo Komura can use destroyer acceleration, smoke, and tight station keeping to crack the aiming problem for attackers trained on older rules. If the Americans still need low, straight passes, there is a path through. The carriers answer by denying the premise. Avengers arrive under fighter umbrellas from multiple bearings, not in a single sacrificial lane. Helldivers pull eyes and guns upward, forcing the screen to divide attention. When the first sets of torpedoes enter intact from altitudes that would have produced nonsense tracks in 1943, the defensive time budget collapses. A ship can counterflood, regain power and retrim, but those actions steal minutes. The next section will spend approaching from another quarter. Destroyers can throw smoke and yaw hard, but hard yaws open broader presentation to the next run. Every correct Japanese move now trades one danger for another. The stakes are exact. If these employment profiles fail in real sea states, the sortie keeps momentum, and the carriers burn cycles they need for Okinawa. If they work as drilled, the last credible Japanese surface threat disappears before it ever sights the transport lanes, and the lesson: release fast. Release higher. Attack on crossing axes, graduates from test reports to standard operating. Procedure across Task Force 58. One side is leaning on the memory of what used to stop torpedoes. The other is betting that a revised envelope executed without commentary will make that memory obsolete within a single afternoon. The wire is tight. It will break toward whoever is right about the water a torpedo needs and the seconds a battleship has. Before the Americans changed how they dropped torpedoes, Japanese surface groups were built to kill the approach. A battleship's dual-purpose batteries threw timed bursts. The light guns filled the near zone with tracers, and the destroyer screen cut hard S-turns to break up any straight run. Smoke generators thickened, the waterline wakes stacked into confused chop, and the only sane lane was the one every defender expected: low, slow, directly astern. Early Mark 13 seconds punished that predictability. Skip, broach, nose over, or a broken tail were common enough that a properly handled weave could wait out most attacks. Crews on both sides carried that memory into 1945. The change was not a new ship, it was a new envelope. The same Avenger now carried a Mark 13, wearing a plywood drag ring on the nose, and a box tail on the fins tuned to enter water at higher speed and from higher release. Instead of bleeding down to stall to avoid shattering the weapon, the pilot could keep energy flatten briefly and let the torpedo slice in clean. That single permission opened tactics that did not exist in 1943. Sections could attack on crossing axes from quarter and beam, not just chase a wake. Fighters suppressed gun crews at the moments that mattered. Dive bombers pulled eyes, and directors high and torpedo planes used the created gaps without having to fly a suicidal mile-long straight line. On Yamato, the defenders' strengths still counted. The heavy dual-purpose guns worked as trained. The light batteries built a near wall. The screen obeyed helm orders with precision. When the first American section came in at a release that would once have ruined the weapon, it was met with the right counter's hard weave smoke flak into the predicted cone. The torpedoes entered clean anyway. The first detonation registered as a short, sharp impulse through plating and deck fittings, the sort of hit that damage control teams are drilled to isolate. Boundaries were set, pumps came online, power buses were checked and restored. The ship answered to helm, but the clinometers moved a measurable amount. What had been a two-dimensional gunnery problem became a three-dimensional trim problem that consumed minutes. Those minutes were the currency the attackers planned to spend. Hellcats raked gun positions to prevent full crews from working their instruments. Corsairs held wider arcs to shepherd the next torpedo sections in. The second set approached on a different bearing using the same higher energy release. Another impact aft showed up as a longer vibration signature across multiple compartments. Shaft response changed, and the list increased by small, confirmable increments. None of this felt theatrical on the Japanese side. Captain Kosaku Aruga's voice stayed even on the circuits. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito received brief, exact status lines. Teams reported, valves spun boundaries, held counterflood ordered. Yahagi illustrated the geometry even more clearly. Rear Admiral Keizo Komura tried to buy time with speed and angle, kicking the cruiser into a sprint that in earlier years would have forced attackers into the worst lane on the map. An Avenger section put a weapon across the port quarter from an altitude and speed that the old tables would have rejected. The torpedo kept track and struck clean. Power flickered, shaft revolutions fell off, and the stern settled relative to the bow. With one metric of mobility degraded, the next approach saw a broader presentation. Destroyers threw smoke and carved S-turns that were textbook correct, but each turn that protected one lane widened the angle for the next arriving from beam instead of astern. American radios carried no narrative. Contact port beam. Run in. Release. Clear. The brevity was not style. It was a control measure to keep timing exact. Section leads called headings and gates wingmen confirmed, and the strike kept its cadence. For the aircrew, the advantages were practical. Higher energy entry meant less time inside the defender's most accurate cone. Clean entry meant a track that did not skip into nonsense ahead of the target's bow. Crossing axes meant the perfect defensive turn to one threat produced a worse angle to another. For the ships under attack, the disadvantages were just as practical. Counterflood decisions stole time. Smoke bought seconds that the next section would spend approaching. Helm orders that saved one flank exposed the other. Across Yamato, the observable cues stayed technical. Shock impulses were counted. Pumps hammered in steady cycles. Boundary reports stacked and were acknowledged. Clinometers ticked in small, repeatable steps that matched what the air group intended. None of it said the ship would necessarily die at that moment. It did say that every correction required by the first hits reduced the margin against the next and the next, arrived on schedule from bearings that older doctrine had not emphasized. A later American section repeated the pattern at a non-traditional height and speed, achieving the same clean entries, while the screen executed the same correct moves. The cause and effect did not change. When the defenders turned to defeat one lane, they opened another. When they restored power, they traded trim. When they regained trim, they surrendered time. This was not a lucky pass. It was a lane the Americans could open on command. Yamato's bridge runs on short sentences and measured tones, wind and blast noise held outside by discipline. Captain Kosaku Aruga keeps the clinometer where he can see it without looking for it. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito listens as status lines arrive in order bearing of attackers, helm answering boundaries, closed boundaries open, power available. Helm meets the first commands on time, port 5, amidships, starboard 5, and the screen shapes smoke into curtains that help gunners define edges and force attackers to choose poorer lanes. The first detonation registers as a compact vibration through deck and stanchion. Eyes go to the instrument. The needle moves by a small definite increment. Counterflood. Keep steerage. Maintain supply to the mounts. Damage control central reads coordinates, not speeches. A team in the port engine room reports spray at a packing gland, pressure steady after tightening. Pump cycles begin and hold a cadence. Breakers trip and reset in the right order. A petty officer asks for wedges by box number and gets them. The angle underfoot changes first in ankles, then in glass. The wheel answers, but the delay between order and response grows by fractions. Everyone feels the fractions. A new wave approaches. Timed bursts pull patterns in the air. Light guns lace the near zone. The second impact is longer in feel, a vibration that travels along structure before it fades. Shaft revolutions drop by a count small enough that the engineer says the number twice to be sure. Aruga narrows his orders, steady on course, smoke starboard, only do not blind the forward mounts. Ito acknowledges. Reports stack. 3 boundaries hold, 1 opens, counter-flood forward. The list increases another degree. The wake shows a sharper bend, but the next approach arrives on a bearing that makes the bend a better target, not a shield. Down in Yahagi's machinery spaces, the sequence compresses. Rear Admiral Keizo Komura pushes for speed. The strike finds the quarter. The shock travels under boots, gauges twitch, a shaft hunts. Power flickers. A switchboard thunks as a breaker trips and stays down for a beat. Reset hold. A watchstander reports the stern settling relative to the bow. The air smells of hot paint and fuel oil. Valve wheels turn under gloved hands. Chalk marks go on a board, get erased, reappear in a new order. Maximum speed becomes a range. The bridge learns it in the clipped tone that says, limits, not possibilities. Back on the battleship, counterflood carries the expected price. The list changes direction and slows, but minutes disappear into the adjustment. Smoke buys seconds and obscures the ship's own mounts unless trimmed exactly. A chief reminds his team to keep lanes clear for their gunners. The reminder costs concealment and gives the next section a better picture. In the Avenger cockpit, the language is a metronome. Contact port beam. Run in. 205. Release. Clear. The canopy shivers at a release speed earlier drills would have called reckless. Altimeter and airspeed cross-check line up inside the gate. The torpedo drops with a solid clunk, takes water clean and holds track. No one waits for a plume. The crew notes the entry and climbs to egress. The section lead is already calling the next vector. Fighters mark suppression, runs as bearings and seconds. Helldivers pull eyes upward on cue. The torpedo plane's task is to stay on time, drop, leave. On the following pass, a wingman's gyro wanders. He says the drift. The lead answers with numbers, not adjectives. The correction puts the weapon inside the gate. Tracer geometry stays peripheral to the pilot's vision and important only as timing. The radio man rides the net with words spaced like fence posts. Nothing added. Nothing withheld that was briefed. Ordinary objects carry weight in the Japanese spaces. A gloved thumb clears fog from a gauge. A messenger shifts his stance to match a deck angle he only now admits he felt. A pump hits its next cycle and sustains it, the most welcome sound in the compartment. A breaker holds after reset. No one remarks because it held. A crackle runs through steel as a texture more than a sound. The American tempo does not change with the target's angle. Section leads open and close their own gates, and the ones behind them. Fuel states are spoken once and confirmed. Egress paths bend into new approach headings. If a pilot can see a hit without losing time, he sees it. If not, he trusts cadence. The radio man keeps the sequence strict. Brevity is not style. It is control. Another set of vibrations stacks in the battleship's frames. The needle moves by a small, definite increment. Damage control must choose between preserving power or preserving trim. They preserve steerage and trust the pumps. On the bridge, Aruga's tone stays level. Helm confirms answers that take longer than they did at the start. Ito receives a report that smoke must be reduced to keep the forward mounts effective. The trade is understood across ranks and compartments. The next approach uses the wider presentation without comment. The following Avenger section flies the same profile at the same energy and speaks the same words. Release, clear, climb. A fighter voice notes guns, silenced starboard. A dive-bombing voice reports off-target clearing high. No one narrates meaning. The airplane rejoins, checks fuel, waits on the next gate. In Yahagi, the stern sits lower than procedure wants. Komura's staff passes revised speed limits. The helm obeys. Every correct turn to defeat one lane opens another. The board with chalk marks shows the new reality without anyone saying the word. Numbers replace expectations, and orders follow the numbers. Bridge and engine room on one side answer with corrections that each consume seconds. Cockpit and strike net on the other side deliver the same sequence at the same cadence, regardless of result. The space between those two approaches is small in words and large in outcome, and it widens with every pass. The decision chain begins with a simple constraint: the transports off Okinawa cannot be exposed to a surface breakthrough. Admiral Raymond Spruance sets the priority in few words, and Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher translates it into aviation tempo. Find the sortie early, keep contact, and feed it to strike groups in sequence until maneuver room disappears. None of that works if torpedoes still demand the old peacetime tables. The technical answer has been prepared already. The Bureau of Ordnance has pushed the Mark 13 through a late 1944 revision cycle that adds a plywood drag ring at the nose and a tail shroud that keeps the weapon stable on entry. Depth and fuse behavior are toughened, the acceptable release box widens, and torpedo squadrons re-brief how to attack. The change is not a speech, it is a paragraph in a flight schedule and a set of numbers on a kneeboard. Carrier decks make those numbers matter. Ordnancemen fit rings and tails, armourers load and crews taxi by chalk at times that look like factory minutes. Launch, assemble, push a section at a bearing. Hellcats and Corsairs lock down AA windows. Helldivers pull eyes and directors high. Avengers cross the last mile, along pre-briefed axes that do not require a stall-speed tunnel. If a pass fails, a new section follows, before the defender completes its own corrections. If a section loses a plane, the cadence is preserved by the ones behind it. The deck cycle, not any single pilot keeps pressure on. After-action reports keep the pressure from collapsing into anecdotes. Strike leaders note release airspeeds and altitudes that produced clean entries, angles that held tracks through wake turbulence, bearings that defeated weave patterns. Staff officers fold those notes into a simple instruction set and push it down the net that night. The next morning, the same squadrons fly the same rhythm with a tighter gait and fewer wasted seconds. It is not a reinvention. It is a subtraction of everything that does not help a torpedo enter water and hold a line. Logistics turns the subtraction into certainty. Oilers, ammunition ships, and repair vessels sit close enough to keep the carriers fed. Spare airframes and engines make losses tolerable. Replacement pilots arrive trained to the procedure, rather than to any one person's flair. A broken radio, a sick radio man, a damaged turret does not cancel a run. Brevity codes and count-based timing keep sections in step. When a deck needs to recover, another deck launches. When weather moves across a group, another group shifts bearing. The sortie never gets the long, empty minute it needs to regroup. Command climate matches the machinery. Spruance asks for effect and accepts method as long as it holds the corridor. Mitcher tolerates risk within the envelope because the envelope is now empirically defensible. Section leads are expected to release inside the gate or wave off and re-enter on schedule. There is no reward for a theatrical dive into concentrated tracers. Fighter direction keeps suppression runs on time marks, not on feelings about whether a gun looks busy. Dive bombers are committed to distraction at the exact seconds that torpedo planes reach their own gates. If someone improvises outside that window, the strike loses more than it gains. On the other side, the constraint is different. Fuel is tight, dry dock, space is finite, and trained crews are capital. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito cannot bet Yamato on an exchange that leaves her combat ineffective short of the transport ring. Captain Kosaku Aruga cannot accept an evasive answer that saves one flank while exposing a broader plane to the next pass. Rear Admiral Keizo Komura cannot sprint Yahagi indefinitely without trading shaft health for a few knots that no longer break the attack geometry. Every minute, saved by counterflood or smoke, is bought with a new limitation. A slower helm answer, a degraded shaft, a blocked field of fire for the ship's own guns. None of this is news to them. The recognition is procedural and fast. The problem is that the American cadence treats each correct answer as a step in a timed drill. Doctrine hardens in real time. Torpedo squadron briefings emphasize quarter and beam lanes over wake chase, and the radios reflect it. Contact port beam, run in, release, clear. Fighters report guns silenced by bearing rather than by impression. Hell divers call off target and clear high exactly when their usefulness ends. The only expanded vocabulary appears in damage control spaces and engine rooms on the receiving ships, shaft revolutions, breaker status, pump cycles, boundary numbers. Those words multiply because each impact forces a choice between preserving power and preserving trim, between smoke and sightlines, between steering answers and list. Industry keeps the doctrine from being a one-day trick. Shore stations have racks of drag rings and tails, and spare torpedoes arrive with the same fittings. The parts are simple because they need to be. The weapons crews do not wait on a boutique fix. Air groups that rotate in receive the same briefing packets. The cadence remains even when squadrons swap carriers or carriers change task groups. If a ship goes down or a deck is out of cycle, another deck absorbs the slot. A procedure that depends on inventories and schedules instead of personalities survives contact with fatigue, battle damage, and weather. Japanese officers read the same evolution in reverse. Helm orders that were once sufficient open another approach lane. Smoke that once erased a picture also blanks arcs for their own mounts. Damage isolated in one compartment shows up as performance limits 2 frames away. Ito receives those reports in the same even tone with which they are sent, and the orders that follow are the only ones possible within new limits. The sortie continues to obey doctrine, but the doctrine's assumptions have been pierced. The attacker no longer needs the fragile path astern, and the defender's best moves now carry an attached cost in geometry or time. The difference between systems is visible in how each side handles a single failure. An American section that waves off drops back into a queue that will reopen the gate. Its place is covered by schedule, not luck. A Japanese ship that loses speed or power cannot be replaced on that axis. The gap must be covered by the same hulls that have already spent minutes answering previous problems. That is not an indictment of skill. It is a description of inventory. The record that emerges after the day is not a boast. It is a line of numbers that explain why torpedoes entered clean at speeds that used to break them, why ships under strike lost margin in increments that matched the strike's timing, and why the last major surface sortie did not reach the STARS corridor it targeted. The names are present because accountability matters. The tone is cold because the process is cold. America fought like an assembly line. Japan fought like a curator guarding one irreplaceable piece. The break happens in seconds, and then keeps happening the same way. The old script says, force the attacker into the wake, make him fly low and straight, load the near zone, with fire weave hard lay smoke, and wait for the torpedo to fail. The first clean entries at higher speed do not fit that script. Water takes the weapons without a skip, tracks hold, and the wake no longer acts like a shield. Helm orders that once solved the problem for a single lane now open a wider plane to another bearing. Smoke that once erased the picture blinds the forward mounts unless trimmed to a narrow band, and that narrow band gives the next section enough contrast to line up. On the flagship, the indicators make the case more clearly than any voice. The clinometer moves by consistent, measurable increments that match the timing of the incoming runs. Shaft revolutions step down and refuse to climb back to the old set point. Breakers trip more often hold after reset less confidently, and the intervals between pump cycles shorten. The answers to helm take longer. Each correction works in isolation and loses against the sequence. Counterflood preserves steerage at the cost of minutes. Cutting smoke keeps the mounts effective at the cost of concealment. A hard turn defeats a torpedo lane off the wake and presents a broader beam to the next section, approaching from quarter. Nothing here is theatrical. It is arithmetic. The cruiser shows the same pattern with fewer buffers. A sprint that would have broken an approach in earlier years only converts a stern quarter run into a clean beam shot for the following pass. Power flicker becomes a limitation in speed rather than an event. The stern settles relative to the bow by a small but persistent margin. Helm still answers. It simply answers inside a shrinking envelope. Destroyers that once broke lanes now spend cycles throwing localized smoke to protect damaged hulls and running alongside to pull survivors. The screen keeps its discipline. Its role migrates from offense to mitigation. On the strike net, the sound is unchanged. Section leads call bearings, gates release clear. Fighters mark guns silenced by bearing and time. Dive bombers announce their distraction window and leave. The same cadence generates the next crossing axis before the defender finishes adopting the correct answer to the last one. No one asks for effect. They report sequence. A pass waved off does not break the pattern because the pattern is held by schedule, not by an individual crew's improvisation. The moment of recognition comes without comment. On the bridge, the list is a number, not a feeling. Damage Control Central reads boundary status and pump performance. The trade between power and trim stops being a choice and becomes an order of operations. Reports sent up the voice pipes, and internal circuits adopt the new limits, even as the language stays spare. Speed reduced by machinery smoke, reduced to preserve arcs, steerage maintained with counterflood active. The staff acknowledges and adjusts. The sortie still points toward its goal on the chart. The ship no longer owns the seconds needed to get there. What breaks cannot be repaired within the day. The attacker's advantage does not depend on a rare pilot or a unique hull. It depends on a release box that thousands of aircrew can fly and a deck cycle that keeps producing sections on time. The defender's disadvantage is not a failure of will. It is a shortage of inventory and minutes. Each correct defensive choice buys survival in one dimension by selling it in another. Each successful isolation of damage creates a performance limit that the next pass will exploit without changing a word on the radio. Post-war summaries reduce the experience to a few lines and numbers. Torpedoes released at higher speed and altitude entered water clean and maintained depth, and heading with reliability not seen earlier in the war. Crossing axis attacks defeated standard weave and smoke patterns by turning the ideal evasive maneuver for one lane into exposure to another. Heavy ships under sustained air attack lost margin in small incremental steps that matched the attacker's timing rather than the defender's effort. These observations are not accusations, and they are not praise. They describe why the old confidence in forcing a wake chase fell apart at sea. From that afternoon forward, the surface force acts differently because it must. Smoke is cut to keep directors and mounts in action. Hard turns are chosen only when they do not erase the ship's own batteries. Destroyers limit sprints and spend more time pulling wakes straight for towing and rescue. The idea of breaking through to the transports yields to the more immediate task of escaping the pattern. The change does not announce itself. It is visible in how orders shrink to what can be done inside a reduced maneuver room. The title's claim is not that a single improvement ended a war. It is that an enemy counted on a weakness that no longer existed and learned that truth while still underway. The proof is not in adjectives. It is in the rhythm of signals that do not change on one side and the counters that grow slower and narrower on the other. In that moment, avoidance turned into ritual and damage into procedure. The day after the strike, the plots on the carrier flag bridge were mostly administrative survivor positions, marked by destroyers' wreckage lanes, charted for navigation times of last sightings logged in neat columns. The combat part was finished at sea on 7 April 1945. What remained was to turn a single afternoon's method into the way the fleet would do it tomorrow. Strike leaders filed concise notes on release speeds and altitudes that produced clean entries on bearings that beat hard weaves, on how smoke had to be trimmed to keep forward mounts in action, and how that trimming gave enough contrast for the next approach. Staff folded those lines into a briefing card that reduced a complex fight to a short set of gates and timings. The card went across Task Force 58 before night ended. On the flight decks, ordnancemen kept fitting drag rings and tail shrouds without ceremony. Aircrew who had flown the pattern taught it to the men who had not. The radios the next morning sounded identical to the radios the day before, contact run in release clear. The difference was not in the words. It was in the confidence that the numbers were right. A torpedo released at higher speed and altitude would enter water, hold depth, and track. Crossing axes would turn a correct evasive answer into exposure somewhere else. A section that waved off would not break cadence because another section was already on the way. Within the Okinawa perimeter, the effect was organizational and psychological. Surface threat planning moved down the priority list, not because battleships were harmless, but because the method that had removed one in the East China Sea could be repeated if needed. Carriers kept more of their fighters on the combat air patrol ring and on radar picket support, a redistribution measured in sorties rather than in rhetoric. The fear attached to a surface breakthrough became a problem with timings and headings. It did not disappear. It became countable. On the Japanese side, the changes showed up in orders that narrowed. Captain Kosaku Aruga received limits on what helm and power could still do and wrote them into the ship's remaining options. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito still owned the charted intent of the sortie, but each report that arrived after the strike reduced the time in which that intent could be pursued. Rear Admiral Keizo Komura's destroyers took on rescue and smoke duties first, attack roles second. Smoke lay in thinner bands to keep arcs open. Hard turns were chosen with more caution because every correct turn in one dimension had been demonstrated to open a lane in another. The language did not dramatize. It simply recorded narrower choices. The records left after the day are specific. Torpedo entries that would have failed in earlier years worked at higher release values. Clinometers moved in increments that matched the rhythm of the arrivals. Shaft revolutions and breaker status showed the mechanical cost of each impact. None of this claims that one weapon ended a war. It shows why a surface sortie that depended on old assumptions ran out of seconds. That afternoon became the template for how one side would handle any future surface attempt in the same waters. Briefings locked the gates and the sequence. Deck cycles were tuned so that no target got a long pause between passes. Supply ships kept the fittings and spares forward, so no squadron had to wait on a part. Replacement crews arrived into a method rather than into a personality. The lesson hardened because it could be taught in minutes and flown by many. Two questions follow from the numbers rather than from sentiment. If the higher, faster release envelope had been taught to every torpedo squadron 6 months earlier, would any late surface thrust have retained its deterrent value? If a battleship remains formidable on paper, does it still matter when the defender cannot afford the minutes that standardized crossing attacks remove? The next fight in these waters will not involve a battleship trying to reach transports. It will involve aircraft diving at destroyer pickets and carriers through weather and dusk. The same logic applies there. Cadence over spectacle, procedure over promise. The maps and diagrams from the East China Sea sit on the table as reference, not as trophies. The big guns no longer control behavior. The flight schedule does.